My name is Enrique Silva. I am the Associate Director for the Latin American Caribbean program at the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. And I'm also a lecturer in the urban planning program here at GSD. And one of the co-organizers of this symposium. So I'm thrilled, and I can't say it enough, to have so many wonderful colleagues and people, the glitterati of this subject matter here in this one room, and I'm very happy to see so many faces here in attendance. I am moderating the panel titled Assessing Past Responses to Slums, A History of Failure, ? And I'll talk about the question mark. And in many respects, this is a continuation of the discussion from this morning, but we're going to take a sharp turn away from the more abstract, kind of historical, conceptual frameworks that were presented in the morning and take a tack towards the critical assessment of policies and public policy institutions that, quote unquote, are trying to provide a response to or tackle the issue of slums, informal settlements, or any one of the terms up above. What we've asked each of the panelists is to kind of pick an intervention or an approach and give us a forensic analysis of it, and to talk about it, whether or not this response was a failure. So in many respects, this is a presentation or a panel that's not only talking about actual implementation or policy responses to this enduring phenomenon that we're calling slums, but also to question whether or not they were failures. I think implicit in the title, as had been mentioned yesterday and again this morning, implicit in this, the title of the symposium and in the conceptualization of the symposium is the sense that something has not worked. At best, it hasn't worked, and at worst, it's been an utter failure. And this is the session, and it's kind of fun to be in a session about failures, where we not only look at the policies much more critically about what worked, didn't work, but also, interestingly enough, and this came out of a preparation conversation with the three panelists, really questioning what is a failure, and then kind of the classic academics: a failure for whom, a failure when, and so forth. And so I'm really excited to have these my three colleagues here who will talk about different types of interventions and engage with one another around their interventions. And then we will open it up, and I would love to hear from all of you as well about what you think is or isn't a failure in the past, over the course of the past 150 years of responses. And keep in mind also, within the context of the symposium, especially for tomorrow, that this is the session, hopefully, that will start giving us some clues or insights or tools to think critically about current interventions and innovations. The idea of doing this forensic analysis of past responses isn't so much to kind of go back and critique and point fingers. It's really to glean some lessons to help us understand and evaluate some of the current practices that some of us call innovative, vanguard, on the vanguard and on the cutting edge. And hopefully you'll see some of those tomorrow, and that we'll look at those tomorrow not only with this kind of fascination about what's going on now in the field, but also to think about whether or not they're replicating some of the lessons. And if they're not replicating, what is it that they're changing, and how hopeful can we be with what's going on in the field right now? So this morning hopefully will be a great food for thought for us tomorrow, and this is a bold-faced pitch to have you come back tomorrow, because that's when you'll see these great practices. So without further ado, I want to briefly introduce our panelists. We're going to start off with Sheela Patel, who's the founding director of the Society for the Promotion of Area Resource Centers, SPARC, and the chair of the Shack Dwellers International. We're going to then go and let's hear from Michael Cohen, and should we get it out of the way? The other Michael Cohen, assistant professor for international affairs and director of international affairs programs at the New School in New York City. And we will end with Jake Wegmann, assistant professor at the School of Architecture at the University of Texas at Austin. Each presenter will have about 10 to 12 minutes timed, and then we're going to take a different approach from the last panel. Our panelists asked me if, instead of going straight to questions and answers, if they can engage with one another. And that engagement comes from a wonderful discussion around this idea of what a failure is. So before going to your questions, they will have at it, and then we'll pass on to you. So without further ado, Sheela.
I'm very flattered that I'm called the glitterati. I'm usually called the pest. So thank you for that. I just want to thank the last panel for going into a bit of history, because in anything that you want to do in the future, if you forget history, you make the same mistakes. But I also want to say that history is often written by those who are in dominant positions to serve the interest that serves the majority and therefore produces solutions that work for them. And I think that's very seminally central to the emergence of informality and slums in all our countries. And it'll continue like that until we allow the dominant rhetoric of why they were formed, why they continue, and why we can't put enough resources to deal with them. When I speak to people in my own country working on public finances, they say we need 3 to 5% of GDP to address this. And we don't have that money to put it, and therefore we do what we can. And that's one of the things which I would like those of you who are involved in public finances or in finances in general to explore and address, to say, is that a logical and a valid reason to ignore something that's so important? But if we look at the present situation in the 21st century, the global agreements on the Sustainable Development Goals, on climate change protocols, on lowering the carbon footprint of the world, has produced for those of us who are in social movements a new opportunity to explore the dialogue and discussions with the transformational process that everybody aspires to have to make this century different from the past ones. And since a very dominant phrase in all this is leave nobody, no geography behind, this is a very seminal moment to define what those geographies are and what those spaces are, and who's going to be involved in that transformation process. So if we go into business as usual, it'll be some of you in these very elite institutions with your terrific theoretical and framing capacities who will decide for all of us what this is going to be. And we will spend another 3 generations then examining why it went wrong. So I'm here as one of the many ambassadors that are going around the world representing movements of poor and ignored and disenfranchised communities to say, you have the potential, in whatever capacity you have, to engage them. So I'm going to say who we are, what we think about what's happening, and what we think needs to happen. So one of the most important thing is that from our perspective and our historical understanding, this is not just to do with the 18th and the 19th century. This is to do as far in history as you can go, where the accumulation of capital depends on how many people's lives you capture to produce that capital, whether it's slavery or whatever name you want to give it. And what colonization did to many of our countries is that it sharpened the role of cities to produce capital and invited people who could feel their lives will improve with participating in the trade to sit on the periphery. And all our cities' peripheries were pushed every time the big city wanted to grow. So you take any history of any city, you'll find that. And so when you look at most Indian cities, and I don't know so much about Latin America, but I learn something more every day. In Asian and African cities, that's what's happening. The city grows, whoever comes in the way, it's convenient if it's informal because you can push them away formally or informally. and you can do that. In many of our countries, as part of the democratization, all these informal people have a right to vote. So when they have a right to vote, they become important at the time of elections, and then some sprinkling of some programs goes accidentally on some communities, and then some people get all these wonderful projects that come in. And many of those projects are very good. Mike and I have a lot of discussions about that. But they never show their impact in the first 3 to 5 years that they are formed. And since all politicians have only 3 to 5 years, they discount everything that doesn't work, and then those things go into the freezer. And they evolve and they grow, and many of us have gone, those of us who are now in our 60s, have gone back, and they say, wow, that worked. But then it's long forgotten. How it evolved is forgotten. Its financial and strategic plans are gone. And so its potential for scaling and evolving and transforming are lost. So, Nick, you have your fantastic program of good practices. Most of the terrific practices that got prizes were then discounted by people who went and tore them apart and said they're no good anymore. And then somebody came back and said, no, they're terrific. So the question is, who's looking at what when? And I think that's an important part of our discussion today. And so where we come from, we believe that the other traditional 18th and 19th century form of organizing communities, which is settlement by settlement, is now dysfunctional in this century. We don't have the time, we don't have the energies, we don't have the resources to do that, because you need large numbers of poor people organized over long periods of time to develop the skills, the information, the capability, the agency, the voice to contest the solutions that are coming on them, and to seek to move forward in a way that brings them into those discussions where these projects are being designed. So I'm the forerunner of trying to ask all of you, if you're designing anything, call organizations of the poor. Don't be frightened of their hostility. Don't be upset with their critique. Use that to produce new solutions that they will embrace and scale. If something works for the poor, they will multiply it. And today, most of the things that work for them are illegal, criminal, unacceptable. And so we have to change the lines of what's that, because the law is defined by people. We decide what is the law. And so if the law doesn't work for the largest number of people in the city, then something's wrong with the law. We accept that when we talk about the bell curve in education. We say something's wrong with the system if most of the kids fail. But we don't use that in planning or in public finances. So when I was very intrigued with Charlotte's very interesting concept of looking at planning. I never had those words. I'm going to use that, so thank you. Because that planning says this is the line within which all these things are acceptable. And and yet in the future state, that becomes the negative thing because it produces exclusion. And informality represents the lines that planning institutions drew at some point that have become dysfunctional today. And so whenever I go into the bastions of planning organizations, I keep telling everybody, you guys have to have a political perspective. You are not technical and managerial professionals being churned out to maintain the system. You have to look at new ways and new instruments to deal with it. And I don't think that's happening. And I urge all of you who are involved in that to do that. Jorge's invocation of Marxism reminded me of my own experience. As a young person, my heroes were the trade union leaders in Mumbai. I went to them for inspiration to say, how do we change this way of organizing communities? And they said, you're working with the people who are messing our lives. They're taking jobs away from us, and they're disrupting the formal legal. Even then, 30 years ago, only 5% of Mumbai's population was in the formal labor market. Everybody else was in the informal market. But they represented the mainstream. And today they were lost because when they fought, none of us were present. The majority of people were not present. And so it's very important. So the lesson this gives me is that these artificial differences of who's threatening me today are dysfunctional in the larger processes. So one of the reasons I came a little late is we were trying to plan something outside this room of how to invade more institutions. So in a way, we keep talking about colonizers. What I want to say is that it works for our present government and the present elite to retain those institutional arrangements. You can keep blaming the history for your present problems, but you're responsible for changing that. And I can tell you that I don't know of most governments that want to do that. They continue these sporadic, few, must-do campaigns with lots of publicity of some some communities, some slums being upgraded. But it's never enough. It's never something that people want, and it's never done in a decadal way so that you can balance your resources with good practices that will produce transformation. So it's not that there are no good programs. And the one that for me I champion is what Thailand did 25, 30 years ago. Activists working there brought out the fact that 2/3 of the money put for housing in the state housing program were never utilized. And that's the other irony, which I think all of you who work on public finance have to do. There's very little money put for addressing the issues of the poor, urban or rural. But not even 30% of that actually gets utilized. And then a lot of organizations in the North say, oh, that's a problem of capacity. It is not capacity, it is intent. So I urge all of you that when you go in to make these investments, call people. Let the public the public institutions sit across the table with organizations of the urban and rural poor and let them feel, at least during your presence, the potential for this engagement to produce something new and to be held accountable. That is very uncomfortable in the beginning. Every time I met a mayor, there was hostility. It says, why is that woman in this room? She has no formal representation. If she's the head of an NGO, we don't want her, we'll talk to her outside. Why is she sitting on the table? But more and more institutions that are smart and practical bring us to the table. And over a period of 20, 25 years, the mayors who would not meet me for 3 weeks when I asked for an appointment now call me to say we're planning to do this, but they're still few and far between. So in Thailand, they put all that money into an institution whose governing structure was government people, NGO representatives, community representatives, universities. So it's like those ideal boards that we talk about but which never happen. And they gave money to federations of the urban poor that was assisted by that fund to be formed, lent them money to either buy new land or to upgrade their homes or for livelihoods at very low interest rates with money that they kept with them when it revolved. So this was actually money that was a grant to upgrade housing, but it revolved like that. I must have sent from our federation, we have a federation with 33 countries, I have sent housing ministers and mayors from almost 30 to 50 delegations to Thailand. And it's unfortunate that Samsuk is not here because she was the original managing director of this program. And it was all our collective fantasy that our governments would give us that job. India doesn't even use 35% of its allocation for urban housing and improvements. And I had this dream that we'd all do this, never got it. But the point is, it's a good question to say, why aren't governments accepting that? What's wrong? What's wrong with this amazing idea? It's a national government, and both during military rule and democratic rule, this has not changed, and the government continues to give allocation to these things. A lot of problems, a lot of difficulties, but conceptually, this has been by far the most smart use of public finance. And there are other countries too. You ask me and I will tell you after this. So, for me, the whole issue of informality operates on so many different planes. And we need to create a discussion methodology and architecture that has some globally accepted principles, but that can be applied in local contexts. Every city, every country has certain differences. You can't have a cookie-cutter approach, even national approach that works everywhere. Somebody talked about large informal settlements in the last panel, which stay back when the city grows. All our southern cities are growing exponentially, and larger neighborhoods are able to fight the displacement. They are now being ravaged by real estate investments that either want to buy them up or want to get them evicted. They're fighting the the landowners. So there's an interesting thing. Yesterday we were talking about gangsters. In a lot of our countries, there's this whole thing that there are all these gangs that rule neighborhoods. In the absence of a governance structure of the state that comes in, there is alternate governance. So anyway, the long and short of it is, planning for these arrangements is very, very important today, because in every city in Asia and Africa, 30 to 70% of people live in slums, and half of them live in these large informal settlements. So today, as SDI, we call them towns under siege. They are not settlements. They are not small neighborhoods. They are large. They're like large northern cities. And we're saying traditional planning is not going to work. And so one of the things I want all of you to look at, whether we win or lose, is that the county of Nairobi has asked our local federations called Muungano wa Vijiji to design a planning process that emerges out of what people want and present it to the county. And the county will look at how its investment allocations for health, education, energy, infrastructure can be made available to them, and then how other finances can come in to blend with that. We don't know whether it'll work or not, but it's the first real courageous national or provincial venture. We tried to do this in Mumbai, in Dharavi, and we lost. We lost in terms of the right for the people to develop it, but we won in the fact that we stopped the plan of the government to transform Dharavi, which would have made it the backdoor facility for the new CBD in the city. Okay. So in the last 1 minute that I have, I want to say that, I want to go back to my first thing, saying that when we talk about the federation model, it helps city-wide informal settlements to get together, not for political reasons, but for long-term development, planning, and investment. It seeks to bring women into the center of the process, because we keep saying it, people nod their heads, but in most of the social movements, women are not at the center of the process. And there is nobody in the informal settlements more passionate about this situation than women, who struggle for long years in order to ensure that their grandchildren are not born in the same situation. And we all need to accept that we have 4 to 6 generations who have been born and die in informal settlements. And if we want to change that in the next 30 years, we have to do something which is very disruptive and different. So I'm saying explore the federation model. I don't want it all done under STI's head, but look at it as a new way of engaging large numbers of people to produce consensus for something that's good for the city and good for the community. The second thing I want to say is that all the solutions that have been formed come to settlements when they are so dense. You said that they're very dense, and the only thing to do is to get rid of them and do something new that poor people can't afford. So we have to find some way to produce solutions that poor people can produce as transformative once they are out of the bondage of illegality. And so people living and working in informal settlements need that change to come from the legal frameworks. Today, in most informal settlements, working in your home is not acceptable. You can't have a workplace. It's illegal. In Mumbai, if you build a little place to do that, it's unacceptable. And that's the case in a lot of our areas. So if you're redefining what is sustainable, then a lot of things that poor people do are at the heart of what is sustainable. So how can we improve that and learn from that? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sheela. Michael?
Thank you, Enrique. I want to thank the organizers, GSD, Lincoln, the Joint Center for Housing, for convening this, what I would call a collective reflection on where we are in the slum question. I want to respond to Enrique's request to not quite do a forensic examination of a case, but to mention a case, but then also to draw out a number of what I would call conceptual points and operational points. And I come to this having originally been an academic, and then having worked on West Africa, on Francophone West Africa, and then I worked in the World Bank for many years and escaped 20 years ago and back to academia. So that I've gone through the process of seeing up close what is being tried and also what it results in later, getting a little objectivity and distance from it. I was very provoked by the note that the organizers put out, and particularly about this panel, talking about failure, because I'm not sure that we really understand what we mean, what's meant by the term failure. And I want to just illustrate this and go into the case and then draw out some points. So I was hired at the World Bank to work on the Senegal Sites and Service Project, which was the first urban project approved by the bank in 1972. I arrived in the beginning of September. A week later, I was sent to Dakar. The project had been designed and approved by the board, and it was designed by some French consultants with some Senegalese counterparts. And this project was for sites and service, 14,000 sites and service plots to be built over a 3-year period. It was supposed to house 140,000 people. Looking back, we realized that, in fact, that would have been the second city of Senegal to have been built in 3 years. Unlikely. One of the interesting things about this project was that 10 years later, in 1982, only 1,800 of the 14,000 plots were actually occupied. So the project was, the Senegalese government decided the project was a failure, announced it's a failure, asked the bank to close the project to say it was a failure. And I remember being called in by one of my bosses a couple levels up, telling me, well, this really was a failure and you're partly to blame. And I remember thinking about that and saying, well, okay, I'll note that one down. So I was telling this story, fast forward, I was telling this story to my students in the new school. And this was in 2005. In 2006, a group of 8 women students from 6 countries came to me and said, we want to go see that project. We want to go see what happened. because actually we don't really go see what happened very often. And I had written an article in 2000 where I had discovered that the World Bank was operating on urban projects in 7,000 cities and towns in the developing world, and that the other international agencies were in another 4,000. So the sample was 11,000 projects. Cities were affected by projects in housing and infrastructure, environmental improvements, institutional strengthening. And if you think about it, it's actually one of the largest social experiments of the 20th century. Right? A lot of places, a lot of things going on, a lot of social and material objectives, institutional objectives, quite revolutionary. Well, when my students got out to Dakar, they discovered there weren't just 1,800 plots occupied. There were 350,000 people living in this place. That all of the plots were occupied. There were multi-story housing. There were people, it was mixed income. There were 55 mosques and mosque schools. There was the highest rate of young girls' primary school education attendance in the country and in a lot of parts of West Africa. And in fact, this project was a roaring success. So the question was, how is it that something which was a failure in 1982 was a roaring success 25 years later? What do we think about that? And I didn't know. I remember going out and spending a couple of weeks on the site and walking around and talking with people. How do we understand what's success, what's failure? And what I concluded was that, in fact, the bank had been, and the Senegalese government had been concerned about outputs, about how many units had been built, how much water pipe, et cetera, but not about outcomes. The bank didn't have the ability to wait to learn about outcomes, wasn't able to acknowledge processes that would take time, necessarily. And so the students came back quite excited. They said, you were wrong. This thing isn't a failure. This is an enormous success. And then they went to the bank and they presented this this is great. These 8 women walk into a room with 60 men, mostly men, all in their suits and ties, and they said, we didn't come here to evaluate your project. We came here to think about how your project contributed to a Senegalese process of neighborhood formation. Right? And what's the relation here? Okay, well, that provoked another question. How many of the international agencies actually do evaluation 35 years later after a project? So I went to all the director generals of evaluation in different places. The answer was nobody. Nobody was doing evaluation. I don't know whether we do evaluation in this country 35 years later. I've asked people in a variety of countries, do we do evaluation? Max shaking his head, no. You would know. So it raises an interesting question here. What's our time frame? How do we understand this? So the first point, just to respond to Enrique, I don't think we have a clue about the criteria by which we would evaluate success and failure in this particular kind of enterprise. Okay, 2 conceptual points. In September 72, after finding my way to my office, an older British financial advisor in the bank called me in, looked at me very sternly and said, young man, you have to understand something. You can't do a good project in a bad policy context. And I've spent 40 years thinking about that. What does that mean? What he was trying to say to me was that if policies go contrary to the objectives and means of the project design, the project will not be sustainable because there will be competing pressures. What that meant, to give a concrete example, working in Morocco in the 80s, we were trying to do slum upgrading in Casablanca, and the governor had decided to knock down the slums. So do you go ahead on this situation, or do you stop? We stop. Okay. What do we do when the building code says that all the housing in Mumbai is illegal? How can we possibly support what SDI is doing or another agency is doing? Right? So the point being that there are contradictory elements which frame the policy environment in which a project design occurs repeatedly. But of course, analytically, conceptually, we can take this at many different levels. So here's an example. I'm currently working in Buenos Aires in a place called Villa Bente, which is a slum of about 40,000 people in the southern part of the city. Argentina is just about to start, or is already in, a serious macroeconomic problem. Clearly there will be recession. There will be people losing their jobs. Do we really expect that when the economy begins to fall apart, people will be able to go ahead and build their houses and improve their houses as we would expect? Why? Doesn't happen any place in the world. When people lose their jobs, things don't go ahead. So what is the level, when we talk about a bad policy context, how do we understand exogenous phenomena? How do we understand the pressures of globalization, which in turn would have an impact on people's behavior in real places? Right? So when you step back from this for a moment, you say, well, what part of the world is growing now? Which countries are growing? Which countries are having adjustment? Which countries are following austerity policies? If we get into that, we can't have an expansive view that, in fact, public investment is going to be doing great things for the slum dwellers. Looking at my friend from Brazil, this is not a moment to start a project in Brazil. Right? So it seems to me that we need to analytically understand how these external forces and policy effects will determine what really goes on the ground. If we don't do that, it's intellectually bankrupt. We're not really being forthright about this. And so it seems to me we have to get out of being designers and architects and engineers and urban activists. We have to understand the macroeconomics. We have to understand policy, have to understand credit and market behavior, a lot of different things to be able to make sense of this. That's the conceptual part. And it seems to me that wherever we are, we have to think about the consistency between intervention at the neighborhood level, at the household level, with all of these other things. Can this be done? Probably not. Probably not done very well. Because it's hard to do, right? Where do the subsidies go? Is there even money for subsidies, right? Every time we talked about doing a slum upgrading project in the World Bank, and we thought we had 1,000 families there, overnight, there were 2,000 families there. They had heard about it too, right? Right? So this keeps going on. So it seems to me that the conceptual framing of what this is all about leaves much to be desired, and a lot needs to be understood. Let me use another example, and I mentioned this to some of my colleagues yesterday. I worked on the water decade in the 1980s, the International Drinking Water and Sanitation Decade. 550 million people who did not have water in 1980 had water by 1989. 550 million. That's a big accomplishment, right? Everybody would say, well, that's a lot of people. All of Africa, right? All of Latin America, that's a big number. Except at the end of the 80s, more people did not have water than at the beginning of the 80s. So was this a failure? According to whom? If you got water, it wasn't a failure. On the other hand, it didn't take care of all of the demand for the services that was necessary. So this is related to the framing of our objectives and the framing of our ambition. Do we actually believe that we're going to solve these problems? And let's sprinkle in a little climate change, right? There's a little bit of sea level rise going on here. Let's sprinkle in a little bit of this, the end of the future of work, the end of work, and automation, and all these kind of things that are around. My view is we've got to really be cautious about what we actually expect is going to happen, right? And what's the likelihood that working at the slum level is going to make a difference in overcoming some of these problems? And I think there's a real question here. Finally, I would say two things. One that's personal, and another which is a little bit more about the environment. I think we are very much captured by the spaces that we occupy. I know when the years that I spent in the bank, I was very much captured by that. And the way I thought, the way I understood problems, the way I responded almost viscerally to criticism. And it took a long time to overcome that. I had a lot of therapists. They were all students at the New School who told me I was full of it, right? And I didn't understand it, and eventually I understood that they're mostly right. But I think that we're captured, and I think that we're captured by our disciplines. So if you look at the SDGs, my view of the SDGs is their primary characteristic is their interdependence, right, of how one thing is related to the other. So I don't see how single disciplinary approaches are going to deal with any of this. So my view at this point is that we really need a new urban practice. We need a kind of practice that cuts across these disciplines. And I spent a lot of time in the architecture school at the University of Buenos Aires. Nobody there is learning about public health. Very few are learning about economics. They know a lot about design, but they don't know about the other disciplines, right? Much to say finance and environmental impact and social impact. No, that's not what they do. They work very good on design, but they don't handle the broader questions. But the same thing applies in our schools here, right? And I need a visa at the new school. I need a visa to go into Parsons School of Design, where they're also wonderful on design, but God forbid you talk about costs and prices and affordability, right? So somehow we need a way to cut across it, to define a new practice. And I think starting from the issue of the slum is a good unit of analysis, and how we kind of broaden out from that. The other part of it is that sometimes in this work, there are truth sayers. Sometimes. A lot of us, we kid ourselves a lot, but sometimes there's some truth sayers. And I remember at one moment, there was a book published in France by a French anthropologist commenting on my work in West Africa. He said, yeah, this guy is sort of naive. You know, he's sort of well-intentioned, but he's basically naive. He doesn't understand that the World Bank's biggest emphasis and biggest consequences in Burkina Faso, in Mali, in Cote d'Ivoire, in Senegal are not through slum upgrading, through the macroeconomic policies which the bank was imposing through adjustment on these countries. And I think that's correct. I think that's correct. I wasn't happy to hear that. I screamed at this woman for years until I finally realized she's completely right. Right? And now I've got, you know, enough courage or something to say it publicly. Right? But I think the point here is that we've got to really kind of speak truth, not just to power, but speak truth to ourselves as to where we are in this business. And I do not think that one sector, one discipline is going to solve the problem, that we need to be able to cut across these things. And it's a moment for a new urban practice. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mike. Jake.
So I'll explain the slides in a few minutes, but it's been a real privilege just to participate in the lead-up discussions with my co-panelists. I'm going to present a different case of Southeast Los Angeles, and maybe like Michael Cohen's take on this question of failure, it's a little bit orthogonal to the question, because in my case, for there to have been a failure, there would have had to have been a serious attempt to engage with a case. And I'm going to argue that there hasn't been, and I'll try to make a case for why. Now, I don't want to overstate the case that we don't know anything about informal housing in the United States, thanks in no small part to pioneering research from Peter Ward, who you heard from in the first panel, and others who have followed. We've learned a lot in the last 30 years about what he and others have called informal homestead subdivisions. You may have heard the term colonia, which is sort of a subset of that phenomenon. You know, these are, just to review what he said, these are communities in peri-urban locations where lax subdivision and building regulations have resulted in places with poor housing and infrastructural conditions. We might call this informality as deregulation or non-regulation, or, you know, as shorthand, we could call this Texas-style informal housing. Now, more recent research, including by Peter Ward, suggests that this phenomenon is not limited to the border area. It's not limited to Texas. It's, in fact, found throughout large swaths of the U.S. And we're still refining our understanding of this area, but it has begun to seep into policy over the last years and decades. In fact, Peter Ward's own work has directly influenced policy in Texas. There have been some initiatives that really have remedied some of the most unhealthful and dangerous conditions. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, Peter, but I think you'd be the first to say if these efforts don't go far enough, but it would be inaccurate to say that they haven't made any difference at all. But what I'm going to talk about is something distinct from informal homestead subdivisions. There is a condition of fully urban informality, not peri-urban, fully urban informality in the US, in some US cities and suburbs. These are places that have the full complement of urban services, that have the full complement of regulations, subdivision regulations, zoning, as we call it in the US, building code enforcement, and where code enforcement, active code enforcement exists after the occupancy of the structures. We could call this informality as non-enforcement rather than informality as non-regulation. And so I want to show you what I'm going to call as shorthand LA-style informal housing. And I think it's, the reason I'm showing slides is just, I think it's just important to just have a kind of a visual sense of what I mean. So let's say you're on the street in somewhere in southeast LA County, the inner burbs of Los Angeles, if you will. You see a house. It looks like a house on a suburban street. It's connected to utilities. It obtained a building permit decades ago when it was constructed. The owner may very well have a mortgage. There is a second unit behind it. It also complies with zoning regulations. But then, if you know what you're looking for, behind the main house, there is an extension that was built without permits that is a separate housing unit. And then, in the very back, there is a garage, what was once a garage that has been turned into a fourth unit. So what's officially a 2-unit property is really a 4-unit property. You know, you can see that it's subtle as seen from the street. You know, this garage in the back is inhabited. The quality of construction varies greatly. You know, here's a case of just an extremely crudely built shed in a backyard, just big enough for someone to put a bed inside. Here's a somewhat kind of more well-built but unpermitted back house. And then here's a case of a trailer home that was put behind another house and then kind of nicely painted and to integrate with the surrounding property. This is one of the most extreme examples that I came across in a very deep lot, and I'm going to try to point at it. This very, very deep lot here, officially only allowed for single-family occupancy, but in fact you had what amounts to an off-the-books trailer park of 8 to 10 mobile homes, each with a family living in it. They were brought in with the cooperation of this neighbor who waited to build that fence until all these trailer homes had been brought in. It was eventually shut down by the authorities after years of having operated. And just to sort of show what this looks like over the decades, you just see this thickening of the urban fabric, right? Here's Huntington Park, one of these suburbs in southeast LA, and you just see how over time the building fabric just builds to the rear, either extensions to existing houses or new structures in the back. And multiply this over an area home to hundreds of thousands of people, and this is not something that's just happening on an occasional basis. This is a wholesale transformation of the urban fabric. And this is, I think, the paradoxical part. It's also almost completely out of public view, and it's almost totally absent, as far as I can tell, from civic discussion, let alone policy interventions. I think that we lack in this country just even the vocabulary for describing what is happening. We use conceptual categories like overcrowded housing or declining inner suburbs that are valid categories, but in this instance are kind of missing the essence of informality as the mechanism that's really driving neighborhood change. We lack the rich and well-developed theoretical perspectives that have emerged from the global south and so much of what you've heard reflected so far today. In my research and writings, I have tried to argue that this invisibility, if you will, is for at least 2 reasons. And the first one is that LA-style informal housing, if you accept that term, it's interwoven with undisputed, clear private property ownership. Instances of informally occupied property, like homeless encampments or squatting in buildings, in the US, generally speaking, those are rare and temporary or ephemeral. Although we heard from Peter Ward earlier that heirship disputes can tangle titles. So, another way of saying that, in LA, informal housing, in effect, it hangs off of formally owned property and housing. And then in addition to being interwoven, the second reason for LA-style informal housing flying beneath the radar, if you will, is that it's physically hidden. Because there is code enforcement in these communities, informal housing is concealed. It's tucked inside of existing structures, or it's at the back of the lot where it cannot be seen from the street. And actually, one of the things I learned was for legal reasons, code enforcement officers cannot initiate cases on the basis of aerial photography, which I hadn't realized. Which is a good thing in many ways. But code enforcement has limited capacity, and usually the officers can't start cases unless they are brought on the basis of complaints, usually from neighbors. And so if informal housing is hidden, most of it is going to persist over long periods of time. So as a result of all this, in LA, there's no political organization, there's no LA equivalent of Shack Dwellers International. I could detect no sense of solidarity among property owners who had informal dwellings on their land parcels. Instead, as far as I could tell, their incentive was to keep their informal housing activities concealed from each other and from the broader public. Instead, the dominant political ideology that fills the local civic discourse vacuum is what the University of Washington geographer and planner Mark Purcell has called the Suburban Ideal, meaning all zoning and other regulations reflect an idealized community of orderly houses and yards at a very low density, even if this hasn't been the physical reality of the community in decades. And to hearken to Michael Cohen's example, it's as if the Parcelle Asseni development in Dakar, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, that he talked about. Imagine if civic leaders within that development today were pushing for a return to conditions from the 1980s when the physical and human density was a fifth of what it is now. Clearly that would be absurd in Dakar. But that's my diagnosis of the situation in LA. So I don't want to leave you all with the impression that this is some sort of a disaster. In fact, if you visit many of these neighborhoods in Southeast LA County, you see places with robust small business entrepreneurship, both formal and informal. You actually see fairly low crime rates. Compton, which is the best known of these communities, contrary to its reputation, has had a dramatic decrease in violence over the last quarter century. You see communities where Latino immigrants and their descendants have been able to carve out what you could call multi-generational family compounds, which provides a strong sense of stability. Recently, I stumbled on a demographic fact that I just found really quite astonishing. So in the United States as a whole, there are about 2,300 geographic units called PUMAs, defined by the census, and I'm not going to get into what those are. But they have about 100,000 people living in them apiece. And when I looked at the top PUMAs of these 2,300 across the whole US for the share of households that had at least one child in them, 5 of the top 13 were just in this area of Southeast LA. So it's achieved that very rare thing in the US, which is high density urbanism with family life and children abundant. Now, I don't want to romanticize anything. Informality is also holding these communities back in many ways. Their infrastructure, basic services that, well, maybe at least until Flint, we weren't used to thinking of as in doubt, piped water and sanitary sewer are actually under tremendous pressure in these areas. And the zoning that they have, it reflects this 1950s, again, suburban ideal that's totally at odds with the present day reality, and other possibilities like perhaps retail on residential streets or taller buildings are just totally off of the table because of the regulations that exist. And anecdotally, I've heard that similar conditions exist in places as disparate as New York and Sydney and London, where they have the term bed sheds. So my strong suspicion is that once we open our eyes, we're going to see a lot of this sort of thing in the US, not only in peri-urban areas like Peter Ward has documented so well, but also in densely settled city and suburban areas of the global north. So what do we take from this? I think, to me, an excellent first step is to just try to bring this into the light, to just discuss forthrightly what's happening. As helpful as urban and critical theory are in helping us make sense of it, and it's certainly been helpful to me, I think we have to also do a lot of quantitative analysis in the spirit of what the Lincoln Institute does, and what Peter Ward and others have done to make a positive difference in policy in Texas. And just as one small example, with a co-author, Sarah Mahorter, I published a paper with a method for using census and building permit data to try to estimate how fast the informal housing stock is growing in every city in California. And then, for years, researchers working in the Global South with a whole lot less official census data available they've been creative in their use of utility data, aerial imagery, and many other sources to try to quantify the extent and makeup of informal settlement. So I think we can do that in the global north, and that really we should. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sheela, Michael, and Jake. So by request, you wanted to engage with each other, and I'm feeling kind of, I regret doing that because I have so many things that I want to engage with you, and I'm sure. But a lot of themes came up, and I'm actually not quite sure how you're going to engage with one another, but I'm going to provoke, and if the provocation doesn't work, then go at it, and then we'll go. But so a lot of themes came up, and I'm going to focus on two to provoke two things out of many. Picking up on Michael's point about a good project in a bad policy context won't work, and be careful and be truthful and try not to, don't engage or have the right expectations. It made me think, so if Sheela were to approach you and said, here's an opportunity to do something with a particular type of intervention, and the policy context in that situation is not ideal, whatever that would be, would you partner up with Sheela?
Not to put you on the spot or anything.
Of course. Well, first of all, if you're not in an if you're not representing an institution, you have to make your best judgments about whether this is a reliable partner, of course, because they have a track record of doing a lot of good things in a lot of places under difficult conditions. Could they have done better if they had had better policy? Probably so, right? If they didn't have to fight so hard, they might have been able to do a lot more. So I think we're never in a pure, best situation. You've always got to figure out, how to operate here. But I think there are examples. You look at various political realities, including our own right now in the U.S. The question is, which are the battles that you pick, at certain points? And I think that those are real issues here. One of the things that I came away from evaluating my World Bank experience was that we would never say the P word, politics, Yeah. But politics is all over it. It's over local politics, national politics, international politics. So if you're not kind of forthright about what you see is happening, you're kidding yourself. So I would work for you.
And sometimes you need the most help when the macro politics are bad. Because it's very easy to say we won't do an external thing. But the fact is that local people who are vulnerable face the biggest impact of bad policies. So very often, a lot of interventions need to be made strategically at that time. And that's when what comes out locally, if it interacts with people who have a larger perspective, those interventions become strategic. They may not produce magical solutions, but they will produce a way. Most of the time, poor people are sort of going up the down staircase. Their situation is getting worse and worse. So if you can just stay where you are, that's a big win. And so my answer to your question is I will run first to check that, because that's when that alliance is necessary to survive.
But could you speak a little bit more there? And this is something that we grapple with in our work in Latin America out of the Institute. And it actually also speaks to your point about scale and capacity, that scale, capacity, if it's you're confronted with this need to do capacity building at a large scale, so that's not the problem. The problem is there going to be political will to tackle that? There's, from a strategic point of view, in your experience, how do you assess how do you read through the muck in a particular situation to assess that there's an opportunity there, either in the short term, midterm, or long term, to engage and see that, well, from the leadership, right now they won't have the political will, but there's an opening for that, and then I would go in and then convince Michael that the policy context might be bad now, but something's shifting. What's, from your...
I think everything starts with community. Once people are organized and they feel that they can say the things that matter to them, the biggest possibilities come out of opportunism, because poor people and their organizations don't have an entry pass into every place all the time. So it depends on where your entry pass is. One of the things that we seized as an organization was the fact that there is not a single city in the global south that has a complete register which is actually in present times of every single informal settlement that exists in their city. Not a single city. It's always 5 years out of date. Then it has slums which they say are registered or acknowledged because they're old and they're first in line, and then there are the new ones that they can get rid of if they don't. So we've started this program called the Know Your City, where every single informal city federation goes and maps every single slum in that place, identifies the name of the traditional leaderships, their contacts, and then goes and challenges the municipality to say, do you know how many people live there? And the issue of resilience and disasters have made that much more easy, because they all invite global professionals to form their resilience plan. And those professionals and these don't know anything about the people who are not on their radar. But who gets flooded the most? Whose lives get destroyed? It's the poor. So we use this both to challenge the consultants who come and our people to say, now this is your new reality. Do you want to accept it or not accept it? It's very difficult to say, I won't accept it. So these are the ways in which we produce these opportunities. And that's why I clapped when this issue of drones came, because today, the mechanization of technology to be able to document structural informality far exceeds our ability to own that. Our governments make the use of drones by people's organizations in some of our countries illegal, but the city uses it. And it uses it to map the structures before it can acknowledge the people who live there. So we're saying, no, we are talking to all of you, and I know that I have all these young students from MIT and other engineering and technology and all these people who come to Bombay, and two of them almost got caught and sent to the police station because they were caught with drones. But the whole thing is that technology, without giving the right of that knowledge in the hands of the people who are being documented, is unethical. And yet, globally, everybody wants to map everything in the rest of the universe without feeling a sense of responsibility of how that data will be used and its impact. So I want to put that into your bowl.
The other, and then I'll pass it on, and following up on Jake's point, so over the course of, since last night and this morning, there's been a little bit of, and I'm speaking as a planner, planning bashing. We had, that planning is part of the problem. And Charlotte brought it up. There's this, differential planning, and then when it stops being differential and it starts covering a lot, the whole city, it still generates problems and so forth. And then we have Jake's example of a functioning planning system and so forth that isn't seeing the problem. And my question at the end of your presentation, when you said we should actually, transparency, we should be seeing these things, I was wondering, in the context of from discussions from the Global South, do we want them to see that? Do we want that, it's this dirty little secret that they're, I can't believe they don't see this, and I understand the logic behind why, the legality for not enforcing and so forth. But is this a good case of the fact that it's failing at something formal? Is it bad?
Well, it's a really reasonable question, and it's one that comes up all the time. I guess I think maybe in the shorter term, it's good. You could say that the informal housing activities fly under the radar in these places. I think where it becomes problematic is over the longer term, because I just think of in many of these communities, the infrastructural systems, like I said, like basic things like water and sewer are just disintegrating now, and if we think that there are a third of the people living there that are really living there, I think we're going to be in trouble when it comes time to try to upgrade them.
Go ahead. I'm talking a lot. Go ahead.
Just, I think we have to be careful about the technologies. I mean, there's some evidence from some of my colleagues in Buenos Aires have discovered that Google Street View, which I saw you using, doesn't cover all the slums, right? Sometimes it ignores the slums. It puts something else in front of it. Makes it look like they're all nice white walls and stuff. But if you look at the areas, you see all kinds of garbage areas and things that are falling apart. So I think these technologies are not neutral by any means. They're selective, as maps are selective.
I didn't see this sort of perspective about Los Angeles, but many years ago, I had a couple. The wife works in the city council, and the guy is a researcher, and he was actually identifying all these a whole lot of houses that were being, like these extra buildings that were coming up, which he called granny houses. And my thing to you would be to say, what produces this new informality? There is a drive and a reason. And one of the things that he was saying was that there is an aging population, and families want a choice of looking after their elders rather than putting them in a home. So even if you do the economics of that, this is a much humane and a more qualifyingly good way of doing it. The second thing is, whether you like it or not, that population of 1/3 more people exists. Are you going to build another suburb and put new infrastructure there? Or are you going to enhance the infrastructure which is crumbling, which was going to crumble anyway because it's old? So in a new world, you also make choices which are based on need and assessment. And I think one of the things which all of us try to do is to find serious fundamental logic in the choices that come out of informality, because they are the new possibilities that you see. So you will get a federation there.
Thank you so much. So I'll open it up. We have about 10, 15 minutes. Great. And I'm going to ask that you give your name and affiliation. And if you're going to comment, say you're going to make a comment and keep it brief. If you're going to have a question, state the question. We had one. We're going to, from there, and then Mac. We'll take those two, and then we'll go back for the round. A lot of great hands. Good.
Hi, Ben Bradlow from Brown University. This panel linked back to an issue that came up a lot in the previous panel about the relationship between informality and citizenship. And essentially, there were a number of comments in the previous panel in discussion about how, in a way, informality represents a form of second-class citizenship. So, going to Mike's comment about politics and success or failure when we talk about slums, it seems to me that the allocation of citizenship is the fundamental political question that then leads to who actually influences what is conceptualized as a failure or a success in dealing with the problem of slums, or even conceptualizing slums as a problem to be solved by public policy. So what I'd like to ask is if the speakers can reflect a bit more on the specific political configurations that actually make it possible for public policy to not only view slums as a place where intervention is necessary and good, but in order to conceptualize the scale and quality that defines success or failure of those interventions.
Mac and
Well, I have actually two very different questions, but the first one is, to what extent is the LA story actually a story about kind of the institutional structures that actually help to create informality, right? And isn't it a story about how our institutions do not evolve, and sometimes they're obsolete, and so maybe, you know, and what force would actually create, or what force could we create that would actually get us to challenge whether or not zoning and building codes and all that, and the way they're currently kind of constructed and enforced actually work for us anymore, right? And maybe, you know, the existence of this informality there is just a symptom of the dysfunction that is actually the zoning and the building code structures that lead to people having to circumvent them to find ways to live. Or, you know, what Martine would say, just the failure of our land markets. And then, Sheela, about kind of these homegrown solutions and really understanding kind of what's going on in the place, I'm wondering, could you share a little bit with us what SDI learned with the high rises in Dharavi that were built? Because I know that there was an attempt, and I don't know if the idea came from outside and somebody said, let's build those, and but I do remember that when they were first built, they weren't really warmly received by the residents of Dharavi, and maybe you could let us know what happened there.
Sure. Want to take more questions and then do it, or
it's
answer
up to
that?
you. How
Okay.
much you can.
I'll try to respond by maybe linking together Mac's observations with the man from Brown. I agree completely that it's a failure of institutions. Something in local democracy just isn't working, where we just seem to be, and this is true in larger communities that have the most capacity, the biggest cities with the most sophisticated planning departments. They aren't really able to grapple with these changes, so forget it in a small, beleaguered, densely populated, very impoverished city in southeast LA County. I think where it relates to the observation about citizenship is that, you know, in the US context, the unauthorized immigration is the specter that's used to delegitimize the perspectives of certain people. You know, Peter Ward has always noted that in the Texas case. And it's an erroneous perception that the informal housing activities are just, you know, oh, that's just where, you know, unauthorized immigrants live. I mean, yes, there are some, but it's also many, you know, US-born Latinos whose families have been there for 100, 150 years or longer. But I think the trouble is, I guess it really comes down to representation, just the paucity of perspectives and voices that make it into the local political sphere.
So Ben, nobody has the real answer, because there are new shifts that are taking place that we haven't really talked about, and that is that conflicts and climate change, or conflicts that are going to be created because of scarcity of water and other things, are going to produce more migrations than just the classical reason of economic reasons why people move. And so we have two challenges. You have challenges of people who have migrated so far, or from one, even internally migrated. You take countries like India, there is xenophobia about people who come from another state. So this whole imagery of exclusion is actually getting more sharp and more distinct at a time when we should expect more rather than less. When we have these conversations in South Asia and we think of what will happen if half of Bangladesh goes underwater in the next 50 years, you don't need a demographer from some fancy institution to tell you they're all going to run to India. We already have a very large number of Bangladeshis in all our cities who are under the radar. So those of us who work in, and same thing is happening in Southern Africa. So the issue of citizenship now will take an identity will take new ways of addressing in this changing world. Conflicts, so much of the people working on migration are saying that more people from conflict zones are rushing to informal settlements in neighboring countries and cities than to go to refugee camps because of the abuse and the challenges and the long-term no solution factor that's coming out of refugee camps. We don't talk about that in the urban context, but those are the things that we face even today in our informal settlements while we fight for identity and citizenship for the residents. So it's like new doors open, new problems come in. And the fact of the matter is that until there is a larger understanding that these shifts have been happening in the past, the formal culture of identity and documentation didn't exist, so there was greater fluidity, but that's going to exacerbate in this new world, and we have to think about it. But I don't think we have a pathway that is globally acceptable. There are lots of discussions on refugees going into informal locations in neighboring. I mean, what we are seeing in Myanmar and Bangladesh is a good example. How are those things going to get resolved when these things become unnegotiable? So I think that's a very good question, and we should put it into our box.
Great. We have time for two more.
I'd like to
sorry,
respond.
yes.
Just to come back to Ben's comment about participation. I think what it demonstrates is that there really has to be much more focus on context. Right? We have to stop generalizing about politics and participation and assume that you really have to do the ethnographic understanding, work to figure this out. That said, I come from New York, and in New York we say, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu.
Yeah, that's a good one. I'm writing that down.
So I think that's a problem, right? And unfortunately, that principle seems to operate in many places. Of course, not Boston, right? So I think there's a real issue here. We need to have participation in self-defense, right, against interests and things like that. But at the same time, if we overgeneralize it, we really don't get it. I should mention one. I had one extremely interesting interaction a couple of weeks ago with somebody in Buenos Aires who said, we believe that process affects outcome, but why do we believe that every process has to be the same? Why do people talk about participation with a capital P all the time? Right? It's always the same participation. And I must say, I was shocked to hear it. It seems very sort of natural. But in all the years that I worked in the bank, I never heard people talking about slum upgrading being the participatory process of being differentiated from neighborhood to neighborhood. And I asked Sheela, and Sheela said, of course, that's the only way we do it. But I think the point here is that much more attention has to be devoted to context to really understand this.
Thank you. The gentleman right there with the blue shirt, sorry, and then Ranjani and...
Hi, my name is Namesh. I'm from University of Massachusetts, Boston. I just want to give a small example to put my question into context. So I was on a field visit in a small city in India, and I came across two slums which had slum upgrading done around 10 years ago. But then because of the lack of funds that the state had, all the houses that were built did not have any toilets built in them, and never even had a pipeline connection. But because they have been completed under so-called an upgradation project, now they are not eligible for any further programs or anything as such. So now my question is, how do you take care of slums like that which have fallen prey to policy failures or implementation failures, like in this case as such? Because in most cases, when you even think of new programs and new policies, we would be talking about the new slums that have come or the slums which have not yet benefited yet. But in many cases, it would be these old slums as well, which have like these kinds of cases.
You want another?
Yep. Actually, we have a couple of, Ranjani, and then I'll open it up for two more, but go ahead.
Yeah, so this is a question for Sheela. I was intrigued by this. I mean, you've raised very important questions that we keep talking about in South Asia, and everyone is concerned about context, and you are also increasingly, you're pushing the idea of context because you see certain kinds of homogenizing approaches taken by planners and institutions and academics. And I want to ask this question because we often invoke this term, the poor, or the people, or the marginalized, as if it's a category that is transparent. And in the Indian context now, it's not just the refugee who's coming from outside, it's the fracture from within. So the question of religion and caste, this is a burning question in South Asia right now. How do we incorporate these questions in the ways in which we think about informality and marginalization? Because this is actually a crisis of the people. That whole group has got divided in many, many complicated ways, and we cannot ignore caste and religion at all in this conflict that is taking place in South Asia. And I'm sure it's the issue in other parts of the world as well. There's race in other parts of the world. So sometimes I get a little worried about this, quote unquote, the marginal, the people, the poor, and whether we should think about that also as a kind of homogenizing drive. Thanks.
We were talking about poor distribution of resources. This part of the territory hasn't said anything. And distribute it a little equality and gender equality. We'll have Janice, and then over here, Marty.
Well, I'm going to give half my time to Guilherme, but
Okay.
I'll be very quick because I would think students have to have a chance to speak more. But my question was, well, I have three very quick questions. One, to what extent do you think that crises help create solidarity? And how to maintain the solidarity created when the crisis is passed or when the particular battle is won for that small battle in the larger thing. My second question is, I'd like, maybe you can't do it right now, but I'd like to put on the table in the bucket the mixture of three different approaches to the questions we're looking at. The approach by space or place, the approach by poverty, and the approach by universal rights. So we talk a lot about the spatial aspect, which focuses on the territory of the squatter settlement. We've also talked about focus on poverty as a poverty line or below a certain, like conditional cash transfers to deal with income as a way. And then we haven't talked much about, but it's been in the background, the rights, the universal right, the right to live, the right to be alive and not be killed, the right to the city, the right to housing, and the right to be seen and have a voice as a human being, including the citizenship question. So I just put these out there because I think we're going to come back to this over and over again. But those are sort of three levels of looking at this. Okay, now, Guilherme, you can ask your question on my other half.
So hi, I'm Guilherme, master student from Columbia University. In Brazil, we use the word urbanização for upgrading, and urbanização roughly translates as transforming the favela or the slum into something urban or into a full city or real city. I think it's kind of problematic in some ways. So my question that follows up on that is, to which extent should we, researchers, planners, policymakers, and authorities, to which extent should we say how a favela should be, how a slum should be improved or not? Of course, I acknowledge issues of informality, crime, vulnerability, but to which extent should we say what is to be done, and why not should we maybe give some legitimacy to grassroots organizations, to the slum dwellers, for them to kind of say what is their view on slums, on their own housing situations, and how this should be, how they think it should be improved, if so, in their view. Yeah.
One more, Marty. Last one, and then we'll come back to
Just some comments on Mike's formulation, and Mike and I are good friends, so don't mind Mike, about projects and policies and units of you said the slum is the unit. If the problem is structural inequality and injustice, the slum cannot be the unit, right? The unit of analysis has to be the city writ large, right? And beyond that, the power structures and all of that go into it. And the unit of intervention can't be the slum writ large either. The unit of intervention, I'm very strongly with Sheela, it is people. Now I also know that we have to take apart people, take apart women, take apart for all of the structural injustices in there. But the unit of intervention, we have to talk about the slum dwellers, and we have to talk about the informal workers, because those are the basis around which to build alternative visions, right? And so it's not a vision just of the slum, it's a vision of the city, and we have to have people, we have to have processes, and we have to look not just at politics, but power. And what we never talk about is power. And what we've got is cities and elite colluding, and the majority of people with very limited power. So I think this is a structural injustice issue, and we have to think very broadly and not just think of projects in slums, right? Thank you.
Okay. Okay, let me start. I didn't answer your question about high rise. Every community trapped in informality faces huge challenges to go into even walk-up apartments. And there are many reasons for that, which I won't go into now, but which we talk about. A lot of it is to do with the fact that architects don't bother to check with their needs. So over a period of time, we have tried to develop model alternatives using friends that we have who are professional architects and engineers to do that. And we find that they are steadfastly not accepted by the mainstream real estate community. And we have to find ways to do that. But the reality is that most of the people in our federations believe and agree that if you want to claim the land on which you live and you want habitable spaces, you have to densify them. You have to go up. And so that's a big challenge. And what happens is whatever people are ready to do, the format says. So now people are saying, okay, we know how to design it up to 7 floors. The state is saying 21 floors. So again, we go into the next round. So this is a big challenge. But the real thing is that those transitions have not been acknowledged, what the pain and the difficulties are, the transformation of what happens to informal workers who use all the spaces around the place, how do you deal with that? All those things are not, and the fact that there's no elasticity for them. So those kind of things have to be looked at, and those consequences of moving and the pain of doing that has to be looked at. So there's a whole, and we've got young students who come and they really work with us. They find those architectural bits that are there that give us the advocacy and the lobbying instruments to go to government and say, change the norms, change the rules, things like that. Talking about what you're saying, I don't know of almost all top-down government subsidy programs that don't fall like that. I used to sit on the committee of the Prime Minister's Committee in India for the National Urban Renewal Program. I must have spoken till I was hoarse and yelled and screamed. By the time anything I said went into policy, it was so distorted that I couldn't even say that I had anything to do with it. So the reality is that good recommendations go into the mixie of how policy and procurement and tendering comes out, and out comes something that's like devilish in what it does. And that happens because nobody ever talks to people about what they want. And more dependence on small private sector contractors to do these construction means that you're not building somebody's home, you're constructing something and getting money for it, and you don't care whether it's got water, it's anything. And so 45% of those houses that have been built in India remain unoccupied. Look at that. Anyway, so, I mean, that's happening in many, many countries. So.
Just briefly, Marty, I don't know whether I conveyed that I was using the project or the neighborhood as the unit of analysis. I didn't mean to by any means. That what I was trying to convey was that there are multiple layers here. So when I was referring to macroeconomic policies affecting the employment possibilities of people, it was really to get beyond the neighborhood, right? And in fact, I think the argument would be it's hard to help people in a neighborhood if the outside context is so contradictory, right? So I completely agree with the structural argument. What we do with the structural argument, that's more complicated, because I don't think we're very clear about what are the key points to enter into the structure and whether we really can take it on. Right. I'm reminded, I don't want to sound too glib here, but I think it applies. You know, we frequently have there's this phrase, ready, aim, fire, right? And my impression of a lot of the projects that came from the international community was ready, fire, aim, right? It did not understand, it didn't know where it was going, it didn't know what problem it was addressing, but it was fire, right? And you can't address the structural questions if you don't have a sequence that makes sense.
Somebody asked the question about crisis, and then your question about that. I think that, you know, like the Chinese say, every crisis is an opportunity. And if you look at all the crises that have happened in different countries related to even climate-related things, there's an amazing opportunity to produce transformative solutions that produce new ways of working. And because everybody goes in this syndrome of, we've got the money, we've got to do this, go there and do it, it dislocates more people, it produces disjointed solutions, and it produces more difficulty. So the question is, how do those frameworks get set? How does that investment produce new alternatives? And if you've seen, many years ago, Oxfam put out a report in which they said that when there are locally organized communities who can invade these decision-making processes, the solution has long-term impact on development assistance. And that wherever people are further disenfranchised, like in the case of what happened with the tsunami crisis, all over South Asia, the poorest 10% people who had no document, 20% who had no documentation about where they lived did not get access to the house construction funding. So the poorest got left out. And what was their solution? Okay, give us money to just rebuild our house so we don't get dislocated from there. And we got really beaten up by all the people in the aid sector to say, you're setting them up to die again. So people said, yeah, but we are going to die anyway because we won't have a place to stay. So sometimes you have a Hobson's choice and you take something that you can do in that process. People rebuilt their homes And now they're fighting for the right. So you want this place, you put us somewhere else. We as agencies that were supposed to support them said, go find some grant money to buy a place for them. That was how it was. So I think it's there. And what you're saying is really it's the present-future crisis. Party political processes all over the world have learned how to break any form of identity into small bits and say, you are under siege unless you come with us. And so this is producing complete crisis within any movements to bring poor people together. We are facing that right now. I remember when we were asked by lots of people to do surveys, we'd say, we are not going to put caste because we are all poor. And they said, no, caste you have to put, otherwise won't accept your thing. So it was all done under the guise of giving positive discrimination, but it has messed everybody up. And now every caste which many young people who had forgotten that they had a caste are now rediscovering their caste, and they're finding new legitimations for it. So, I mean, all work on trying to produce ways to get out of poverty are now facing new challenges and new difficulties. And there is a new elitism within how you locate your, it's a strange form in that whole section of whose caste will get most appropriation of resources. And it's really fractured everything, and that's growing. And I'm seeing different ways in which that is interpreted based on what in Africa or in different parts of South, even in East Asia, we're finding that. Old identities are being renewed. So in Thailand and Indonesia, we didn't know who had Chinese descendants. Suddenly we're finding that's becoming a way to distinguish the difference, even amongst poor communities. So.
Well, unfortunately, we're at time, and I guess for those that are presenting tomorrow, I guess a warning, because just in the last 2 hours or hour and a half or this morning, a lot of issues came up that at least for me will be front and center tomorrow as we listen to your presentations. But really keen on hearing what your practices and innovations have to say about the logic of the strategy. I think that's something that's come up very clearly. We want to know what your strategy is, what your point of entry, who are you engaging with, and why, and then also this issue of timing. It's like, what's the timing of your intervention and the logic of the timing, as well. Hopefully, we'll get a sense of the background, the strategy, and your perception of what the scale of the issue is that you're trying to address. And then, as was mentioned before, where does power fit into that intervention? So I think, again, with the idea of the relationship between this panel and today's conversations with tomorrow, what do we take from these conversations, and how do we bring them into the conversations tomorrow? Before I thank our panelists, just a couple of housekeeping points. We're breaking for lunch. We don't meet back again till 2:30, so there's a generous amount of time for lunch, which is a double-edged sword. You get to eat calmly, but we hope that you come back. We'll start at 2:30. For symposium panelists, remember we're meeting at a room somewhere here that we'll let you know about. Everyone else that's not a symposium panelist, if you're familiar with the Harvard campus, you know where to go find food. If you're not familiar with the Harvard campus, you can cross the street and go into the buildings that are just across, or GSD, there's a cafeteria. I'm assuming it's still nice out, there's the platform over here that has food trucks, and then given the amount of time you have, you could also wander into Harvard Square for food. But please do come back. It's a wonderful audience, and we start promptly at 2:30. Before you leave, thank you to Sheela, Michael, and Jake.